Hello, everybody. I'm Alfred Mathena. I work for USAA as a risk analyst. I hope everybody's enjoying their time here in Vegas and in this Tableau conference. This has been a year-long journey to be here with you guys. I was at last year's Tableau conference, and I went to a bunch of wonderful sessions and didn't see anything really about risk, per se. And so it made it a year-long endeavor to really make sure that we had something in regards to risk here at Tableau conference. That being said, I want this to be as interactive as possible. So please ask questions, raise your hand, stop me if I'm going too fast. Whatever it is that's on your mind, let's discuss it. I will try to not use vernacular that's quote unquote for USAA, try to make it a little bit more risk-based. When you look at the stuff that's on the slides, it's gonna be more pertaining to USAA, but I wanna see if we can attribute it to everybody's companies here. So again, just let me know what you guys are thinking. Raise your hand, ask questions. I want it to be as interactive as possible. I don't want me just to have to talk to you guys for this hour, because then everybody will be bored and you'll be running out of here in about 10 minutes. Promise, I'm not that entertaining. So a little bit about myself. I have been with USAA for the last 12 years. I've been working in risk for the last 7. The first 5 was in the mortgage industry there, working, I guess you'd call risk. We did underwriting, mitigating that aspect of risk. I now work in operational risk, so we look at the company in holistic view. I work for the enterprise, quote unquote, which is all departments inclusive. So USAA has investments, banking, and of course, most people know we have insurance. So those 3 big fundamental things. Every area has their own risk department. My area, we kind of cover everybody. We run the program, we ensure that everybody understands what it is that they're going to be looking for, what they're looking at. So that's how we kind of came to the predicament, quote unquote, where we needed something to kind of show us what that risk looked like or what it was. Last year at this time, and Peter Trem from Charles Schwab can attest, he and I were meeting, and we were talking about control inventory. So getting a good count of control inventory was a big deal for us back then, and now it's turned into a whole new thing. So that being said, we'll go ahead and get into this a little bit. There we go. So the first thing okay. I guess the screens aren't going to work. So the first thing that we really wanted everybody to focus on within the company was how to assess their risk. What are they going to be looking at? What kind of environment they're going to have? What does it look like in its totality? And to help them, we had them break out their business into smaller sections, right? So, of course, it's not going to work. Awesome. All right. So you guys are going to have to bear with me. For some reason, the slides aren't going through on the screen. So we had them break up their business up into different areas. So across the enterprise, we had about 76 areas. It is now down to 74. And each one area comprised of a larger group, they assessed their risk in totality. So the first go at the assessment, we looked at controls, we look at their risks, we look at what risk factors they had, and then we looked at any kind of mitigating circumstances, influencers, so regulations, government, anything that kind of comes down to us, we were really looking at it. Every organization or every portion of those 74 had 12 risk factors to look at. So I really wish this would work. You want to see if, sorry, he's going to come up and fix this. Don't know why it's not moving for us. So there's 12 risk factors, and we had them look at these risk factors to really understand what is their risk. So there's miscontinuation, fraud. Okay, I'll let him figure that out. I'm not going to worry about the computer component. So bear with me. That's only half the entertainment, right? All right. So they had 12 risk factors that they went ahead and they rated. They had their inherent risk. Was it risky? Was it not? Their different ratings. As they identify that, then they would have an overall inherent risk factor rating. So the overall inherent risk factor rating would then have what I believed, or they believed, was their inherent risk without any risks, without any controls, just what is their risk. You would think that getting people to that point is fairly simple, but as we learned, it was not simple at all. So everything that you think, oh, well, this just automatically happens, or this is my control, so I'm going to count that. Getting people to not think about that was really difficult. Yes. It's going to work, guys, I promise. This is not going to be like certifications yesterday, right? Cross the fingers. Okay, so as we had them look at their risk in totality, they gave us their inherent risks. Then we asked them to look at their controls. Okay, so here's all your controls. What does my control environment look like? Do I have strong controls? Do I have weak controls? Are my controls detective? They're preventive? Are they manual? Are they automated? Maybe some automated with a little bit of manual component. What does that really look like, and how does it help me do my job? Yay. Oh, there we go. Maybe. Really? Interesting. That's halfway there. Okay. So as they were looking at their control environment, they were able to then tell us what their overall risk is. So now I've been able to mitigate my inherent risk. I'm looking at what my overall risk is. Now I have an output. Sorry, I'm distracted by lights. I have OCD, so get shiny objects. Fair enough. So as we had them look at their risk, had them look at their controls, we're able then to get to a residual risk environment. So now we understand what is the risk after our controls, after we have everything in place, what does that look like? The next endeavor was to look at what is your third-party risk. So when we first brought this up within the company, a lot of people just only thought of third-party risk as external risk factors. So I'm relying on somebody in Malaysia to answer phones in the middle of the night. So that's my third-party risk. What we had to get them to take a step back and realize is that third-party risk isn't just external, it's also internal. So there's a mailroom. You have mail-outs that go out. You're reliant on them to perform their function, their role. How are they doing? Do you have insight into that role? Do you have insight into that process? Do you know what their risks are? Are their risks the same risks as yours? Are their controls the same as your controls? Do you have a monitoring control to ensure that their process is mitigating your risk? These are all questions that we really hadn't gotten into depth in or really even started to look at. So we had them perform this assessment, and we gathered all the data. And this is kind of what you're starting to look at here. So on the screen right now in front of you is what they rated their own risk factors for. Like I said, we have 12 risk factors. That's all right, I'll grab this one. We have 12 risk factors, as you see right there. And they all rated them, whether they were critical, high, moderate, or low. If you notice here at the bottom, that green, the green means that it wasn't relevant to them. This was one of the biggest glaring insights for us. So I'm going to get down because I can't really see that my computer's not working, and sorry, forgive me. So one of the things that I found really interesting, or that a lot of us found interesting, was how much people said that they were not dependent on models, right? So there was no risk for modeling. In an insurance company, or a banking company, or an investment company, wouldn't you think that we're relying on models? So to say it's not applicable, and you see that that green bar is super high, right, is pretty eye-opening. Now, before we had kind of the visualization or the really insight into it, we all kind of assumed that people were looking at it. So this really showed us what were they actually paying attention to versus not paying attention to, what was important to them and what was not important to them. Which question?
Would the model risk be sort of not what they're thinking about because it's government-mandated models or other things like that, so they don't have as much control? Or why do you think they weren't believing that?
because they were relying on somebody else. That was the overlying thing, right? So we have a modeling department, they handle models, it doesn't really impact my process. It doesn't impact me, right? So if it screws up, that's on them, it's not on me. So we had to get everybody out of their own little bubble, right? Everybody's the most important person in their own little bubble. How do I get you outside of your bubble to look globally, not locally, right? So that was kind of the overlying theme to that was, they handle modeling over there, it doesn't really impact me. We just take a little piece and we use it, but they govern their own thing, right? That analysis of that, based off of this, was one of the things that really kind of get started in thinking a little bit more deeper on monitoring controls. So now I understand, hey, I do have a modeling risk. This needs to be changed, right? I need to really focus on how much of a risk is it. And if I don't have controls, and if I'm relying on a different team, maybe I should start developing a monitoring control, right? The other one that's up there that was really surprising to me was data quality. Now, I guess let me give you guys the caveat. The numbers that are up here are not reflective at USAA. These are artificial numbers. They're somewhat similar because I wanted to kind of keep the same theme going, but none of the data that you see is reflective of USAA. This is Alfred 101, not USAA 101 for the data, okay? So another aspect was data quality. As we'd been diving into the risk and diving into risk culture and diving into issue management and operational losses, our executive leadership wanted reporting, right? They wanted to see what did that look like at their own levels. And so what does that look like? Well, every executive has their own reporting team. Every reporting team creates their own data. And guess what happens? Every executive has a different number. They go to board. All present a same slide of the same material, all with different numbers. It's amazing how it happens. And I'm sure, actually, if I can get a raise of hands of people that have been in that predicament before. Yeah. It's generally widespread. I love it. It's one of my favorite things in the whole world because somebody could maneuver in Excel one way versus another, and now you have a completely different number. Or you pull data on November 10th, somebody else pulled it on November 18th, and completely different, right? So when we saw that data quality wasn't up there as well, like a lot of it was not applicable, we had the same question. Well, why are they saying that data isn't really a risk? Or why are they saying that from an inherent perspective, if I have no controls, why is that not a higher risk? And we identified that, again, the reporting team pulls that. That's not part of my process. That's not what I do. That's not part of what we do here. That's somebody else. So again, back to the whole monitoring controls, understanding how to get outside of your bubble. So the next thing that we talked about was the gaps. So as we identified people that said, hey, I have a risk in a certain area, so I have a risk in business continuation, right? But I don't have any controls to mitigate that risk. Or I say that this risk is applicable to me, but I don't have any risks identified. If the business says that there is a risk that is there, then they should be able to identify what that risk is. They should be able to tell me what controls they have in place to mitigate that risk. And if there is no controls, why are there no controls? Are we okay with the risk that we have? Which is fine, right? We're okay with accepting some risks. Risk has to happen. You can't be perfect. So as long as we do that, then we should be good to go. You'll notice here too, at the far left, right, there, I believe that, I can't see my screen. Sorry, guys. So the number of processes without risks. So if I have a process in place, there should be a risk, right? I shouldn't necessarily have a process or something that I'm doing where there is no risk associated. Has anybody ever seen a process or something that is done within your business that you don't have a risk? Yeah, me neither. So because I hadn't seen it, that was something that was really glaring to me, was when I saw the exponential number of processes that had no risks. And then as we saw the risks, we looked for the controls, and we identified an exponential number of control or risks with no controls. Again, just having an awareness of that was key because we didn't have that insight before. So leveraging Tableau allowed us to kind of give them the pretty picture of what it looked like. What am I missing? Where is it going? Kind of like this, right? So my glaring picture is I don't have my data up, but I know there's a problem. Don't know what the problem is, right? So now I can look at it, I can understand what that data is, where the problem is, where the problem lies, how that's going to affect or impact me. Yay! Thank you guys, y'all are my hero, I appreciate it. All right, so now here we go. Okay, so on the far left of the screen, you'll see that there are processes without specific risks. So when we define a specific risk is, I don't want you to tell me, oh, well, within this process, we have a business continuation risk. Well, yeah, you do, because if the process stops and doesn't work anymore, well, what's going to happen, right? You got to have something in place. But what is the risk of that process stopping? We wanted them to be very specific as to what the risk was, and then to be able to tell us what the control was that would mitigate said risk. And then on the bottom left were the specific risks that had been created without a control. So now I've been able to get them to tell me what their specific risk is for the particular process, but what is the control? If you look on the right side of the screen, it's the number of experiences or processes with an applicable risk. So when they rated their inherent risk rating, they said, hey, I have a risk here, but then when you got down to it, you got into the, sorry, does everybody know what an EGRC tool is? It's the tool where you put your risk or your controls in. It's kind of an inventory. So when you would go look at their inventory, they wouldn't have a specific risk or a tier 2 risk, a risk factor that actually went along with it. So, hey, I know that there's this risk, but I'm just not going to write anything up about it, was kind of the mentality here, right? So again, the awareness was the issue. There was no insight to it. People couldn't see it. They didn't know what to do. So when we would say, hey, we have all these problems, or hey, your control environment is worthless, well, I don't know. I don't see it. Well, now they're starting to see it, right? They're starting to get a glimpse at it. They're starting to understand it, starting to look at it. So then we go into the control inventory. So now, this was my cup of tea last year. This is what I was all about, was, well, how many key controls do you have? How many non-key controls do you have? What does your control environment look like? Well, as we started getting into it, and we started showing this kind of information to them, they're like, oh, well, that's not really a key control. If that control goes away, we're okay. So if you look here, like it says all these key controls, right? Like how many key controls are out there, how many non-key? It was really eye-opening to show that the majority of our controls were quote-unquote key. And if they went away, we would cease to do business, right? With the fact that 2,000 of our processes or so had no controls, quote-unquote, I found it hard to believe that the variance was so high. So again, bringing that awareness to these executives or to the people running the business was very valuable because now I could say like, hey, what's actually out there? What's actually impacting my business? What can I do to move forward? How can we drive that cultural behavior of risk to not just the risk partners within every area, but then also the individuals who are running the business, right? If you look over in the middle, how are their controls designed, the control strength? My favorite is control nature and purpose. So, a raise of hands, how many of you have seen a control that is manual and preventive? I don't see one hand. Excellent, because there's no such thing. However, in our environment, we had more manual preventive controls in place than any other type of control. So that being said, that to me means that we don't know what the control environment really is or looks like or what a real control should be labeled as. So something else that we were able to take back to the business and say, hey, you may want to relook at this to really understand what that looks like. So against my better judgment, we're going to get out of this slideshow and we're going to go to the actual dashboard. So if you'll bear with me through the slowness as if anybody went through certifications understands, the internet here is not working fabulously well, and the computer issues are already at hand. This is the assessment that they performed. So this is, we call it an RCSA. I'm sure other people use the same terminology. So this is a risk control self-assessment. They identified all their risks. If you look at the top, it gives you the control strength. It'll give you your inherent risk, your residual risk, and then your risk direction. As you look at that, fine and dandy, this is kind of at the enterprise level. Everything's there. What was really valuable and insightful to our executive group was the second layer with all the words. It was, what was the justification? So great, I'm critical or I'm high, but why? Why am I high? What's also there is, did my risk partner or my compliance partner, did they agree with me when they looked at these assessments? As they identified these assessments and said, hey, I agree, that's great. If I disagreed, why? What was going on with that? So this is able to give them not just the visualization of where they were ranked or what they were rated as, but then also how did that really impact me and my business, and what was the reasoning for having those ratings? The cool thing, as we all know with Tableau, is there's the filtering capabilities, right? So here, as I am looking at this, I could filter from the complete and utter organization to all 74 of those different areas that I told you there were. Now, every 74 one of those areas belongs to a bigger portion of the organization, and they could filter it at that level as well, depending on which executive or which person is looking at it. I could get it to go from the top level that I'm going to present to board all the way down to a first line employee that's just assessing risk for the first time or understanding their process for the first time. What does it look like to them? Any questions so far? I'm not trying to ignore you guys. Just want to make sure. No? Perfect. All right. So back to the controls. Here we go. So when we looked at the key controls and how that really impacted our environment. So this dashboard is just about key controls. We're only talking key. There's no non-key. The difference between key and non-key is if the non-key fails, no big deal. Key control fails, done in the water, right? Everybody got that? Perfect. All right. So as I was telling you guys before, if you look over there on the far right side of the screen, the manual preventive, so that long red line at the bottom, that's what everybody in this room already agreed that does not exist. So you see how that's a problem? Okay, we had no insight into that prior to this type of visualization because there was no real way for us to put it together. You can put it together in a nice, pretty Excel. Somehow those Excels get manipulated and it doesn't turn out the right way. Now there's kind of no way around it. Everybody gets to kind of get that visualization. When you look at your control testing, so this was another thing that really impacts us, is the control testing. Who tested? Where is it tested? By whom? Did it pass, fail? What's going on? So because in our EGRC tool, we have the collection of our inventory. We have another tool for the testing of inventory of the controls. We have another tool for issue management. We have another tool for XYZ. We didn't really have a way to pull it all together. And so everything would just be individualized, right, in the visualizations, which, as we all know, is problematic when you try to blend data that's not really put together, especially when you have all these different Excels, manipulations, different departments running them. It makes it a little bit difficult. So this was something that we could really look at, put it all together, give them a nice little visualization of what it looks like, and then now I can go forward and really push on different agendas within my control environment and other things. All right. So one of the other things that we were able to kind of pull into was also, what is the regulations that are impacting these different processes? What does it look like from that particular level of detail? Where are they impacting them? Who are they impacting them as well? So a regulation that impacts bank, and so I have to mitigate a risk for bank for this regulation, may also impact or property and casualty insurance, and it may also impact investments. So understanding how those regulations go across the board, who they're impacting, what risks are already out there, what are they already tied to, what controls are already out there, so we're not duplicating work, we're not triplicating work, we're not adding more effort to our employees, we're able to kind of understand of where they lie. So this kind of gave us account of what are the regulations that are tied to particular processes, how many processes have a regulation tied to them. The other thing that we had going on was people were removing processes. Oh, we no longer do that anymore. But they weren't identifying that the regulation that was applicable to that process is still there, not there. Was that risk removed? Was it not removed? And we really had no insight into that either. So they were making changes at a faster clip than we as an operational risk program could keep up with until this. So now we're able to kind of keep up with all those changes. Now we're able to kind of give them an insight. Hey, you can't really retire that process. You have this regulation or requirement from the government that's going on that you need to make sure that's tied somewhere else, or that we're at least mitigating it somewhere. You can't just remove a process, which was kind of what their thing was. It's what they really wanted to do. They just wanted to kind of up and change. A lot of times it was a naming convention change or something like that. But when they would just remove a process in its entirety, it was a very scary thing when we didn't have any kind of quote-unquote controls in place to mitigate those types of changes. So the last thing that we, the last thing that we were able to kind of dilute with this was, can we give it a scorecard? Right? So they've assessed themselves. We've had risk and compliance review their own assessments, tell them if they agreed, if they didn't agree, what the justifications were. But then what does that really look like from an operational risk perspective in totality, right? So what we're able to do is kind of come up with some different factors, so to speak, and have us guided to an overall end result. So these were some of the things that we looked at to make those assessments. So this slide right here is a portion of the scorecard that revolves around risk control inventory for this assessment. What's not included is the operational risks, your third-party risk management solutions, your issue management. Those kinds of things aren't in here yet. So when we were looking at operational risks, and we were talking about these operational losses and how they would impact the business, what we noticed was the operational losses weren't really identified at a level low enough to be able to drive behavior at the first line level. So a lot of the operational losses were captured at a higher clip. So we'll take a mortgage industry scenario. So I have a buyback issue from a mortgage. Well, that's a cost, right? That's an operational loss. Should have happened. The underwriter who underwrote the loan should have caught what the problem was. Now we have to buy that loan back. Costs USAA money. What was happening was that operational loss was being captured in 4 different areas and assigned to 3 different other areas as the loss. So really understanding where that loss was, now we could then dedupe that, remove the duplication of losses, assign it to a particular area, and then truly understand where that loss was applicable. That being said, we're able to get a better understanding of how the operational losses impacted us. Then we moved on to issue management. Issue management has been one of our tricky pain points. Nobody wants an issue, right? Nobody wants to create their own issues. Nobody wants to have them out there for a while. Everybody wants to close those issues as quickly as possible. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're always closed adequately. And what we had noticed was that there was a lot of issues that were reopening, the same type of issues, not the same name, but same type. And it was just because they were trying to close them out and get them back open. So with the tracking that we were able to do within Tableau, we were able to identify those and say, hey, kind of slow your roll. Let's make sure we're mitigating these issues correctly the first time so they're not reopening. Those are some of the insights that we have gained from Tableau. So I want to open it up to questions. This kind of concludes everything else that we looked at. So if you guys have questions, please raise your hand.